what do you think is the greatest negative consequence of demographic group disparity?
It's probably the generation of envy and hatred. I would say that's the biggest danger. The second biggest danger is probably the absolute poverty that might be associated with it. And then the third biggest danger would probably be the relative poverty. But I think the biggest existential danger is probably the envy and hatred that it generates. So, because that's very, very dangerous. So, that's what it looks like to me. See, I guess there's one other thing, though. I guess I don't exactly like the question. And the question's ill-formed to some degree, because demographics sounds like something. But it's a box into which you can put a very large number of things. In fact, an indefinite number of things. And so, no matter how egalitarian the world is, there will inevitably be dimensions along which people radically differ. There's no getting rid of the inequality. And so you say demographics and you think, well, age, sex, ethnicity, race. It's like, yeah, those are the four that everyone is noticing at the moment. But they're not even necessarily the four canonical demographic differences. Attractiveness, height, health, intelligence, education, etc., etc. Prowess, talent, and there's multiple talents. So people differ. People can be grouped into an indefinite number of groups. And there's going to be profound differences in the performance, privilege, and oppression along every one of those divisions. And so that's why I think that it's the envy and the hatred that's the worst. Because the consequence of breaking up the world like that and then viewing the inequalities is that that's going to generate envy and hatred, and that'll take everyone down. So, one of the things I figured out, I've been writing the preface to the 50th anniversary edition of the Gulag Archipelago. And so I've been working on that for about the last month. And I've been trying to figure out why the Russian Revolution went so wrong so quick. Because it went wrong right away. Even though, hypothetically, it was motivated by the highest of ideals. I figured something out about that, too. The highest of ideals requires the most extreme sacrifices and justifies them, right? The more, what would you say, the more stellar the target, the more the sacrifice is justified. Okay, but you could flip that. So then the question is, well, who or what do you sacrifice? And the answer might be, well, all the people that are in the way. Well, then you might say, well, maybe you don't have any utopian vision. You've just generated an excuse to sacrifice everyone who's in your way. And so that's part of the reason why the Russian Revolution went wrong. It's because we think, oh, the utopian vision, oh, that justifies the sacrifice. It's like, yeah, if you assume that the people who hold the utopian vision are saints, and that all that's motivating them is the purity of their vision, and that they're actually only after what they're after, and they're only after that for good things. It's like, you know anyone like that? No. And if you think you're someone like that, then you're definitely not. So maybe the utopian vision is generated to justify the murder rather than the other way around. And I really think there's something to that. And then I was thinking too, well, we need a vision of the future to work towards. And we have to make sacrifices to make that vision a reality. You know, you have to make sacrifices to improve your life. Everyone knows that. Well, so then what's wrong with sacrifice on a mass scale? Well, the question is, something has to be sacrificed. What's the proper answer to what should be sacrificed? And the proper answer seems to be you, not them. And that's why I think the Judeo-Christian substructure that our society fits into is correct, because what it demands is individual sacrifice. It's you that's not good enough. It's your fault. You should improve yourself. You don't sacrifice other people to your utopian vision. If it's someone else, if it's the class enemy, if it's someone else, then your vision is suspect. And that's all buried in that question, hey? Because it assumes that you can divide people into groups, that you can get the division right, that you can divide them into the haves and the have-nots, and that fundamental inequality is somehow unjust. Now, sometimes there is injustice, but it's a very dangerous way of parsing up the world.
So then the perfect follow-up, which I was going to get to anyway, can individualism then go too far?
Oh, well, definitely. But I'm not talking about individualism fundamentally. I'm talking about individual responsibility. So that's different, because individualism is often your privileges and your rights. And that's often our conversation about individualism, especially in the last 60 years, has all been about our individual rights. Well, that can go way too far. That's just narcissism if it's pushed too far. Say, no, forget about that. Individual responsibility. Can that go too far? Well, usually it doesn't, because you don't meet someone very often. You say, that person's just too responsible. Now, but that can happen. That can happen, because it's okay to share the burden, right? You don't have to you should try to do everything you can yourself. You should try to do that. Shoulder as much responsibility as you can. But what's important is the you can part of that. And I've tested this with a lot of my clients. So one of the populations of people I worked with were people who were they were stellar lawyers in very high functioning firms. And so they were people who were working 70 or 80 hours a week, flat out all the time. And they were kind of wired for that. They wouldn't have never been in a position like that, or what would you had the ambition for a position like that, unless that was the sort of people they were. Very, very conscientious. And the question is, well, how much should I work? Well, and part of the answer is, well, you should work flat out. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, do you work yourself to exhaustion today? Well, that doesn't bode very well for tomorrow. So no, maybe you work yourself to exhaustion over a week, but then you've got the next week to deal with. And so one of the things that I worked out with these people who were prone to take excess responsibility was, how much can you tolerate if you're playing an iterated game? That sort of goes back to the discussion we had at the beginning of this lecture about, the fact that things iterate. And so the ethic that emerges has to be an iterated ethic. It has to work across situations. You shouldn't work so hard that you wear yourself out, because then you can't work. I mean, there's other reasons you shouldn't do it as well. But you can't work any harder. You can't take any more responsibility than you can sustain. And so there's a bit of mercy in that. And so even individual responsibility can go too far. But it usually doesn't. And so generally individualism goes too far because people harp on about their rights and their privileges. So you counteract that and you say, no, forget about that. The only reason you have rights to begin with, in some sense, is so that you can bear your responsibility properly. And then if you do that, you work for yourself, but you also work for your family at the same time. And you work for your family and yourself at the same time as you're working for your community. And so that kind of binds the individual into the collective in the proper manner. And then you don't take more responsibility than you can sustainably bear. And that means that you're being fair to yourself. And that also means that you can be productive over the longest period of time. So that works out quite nicely. What I did with most of these lawyer types, what I did with them usually was they couldn't work fewer hours a day, because that just wasn't in the cards. If you have a really demanding job, working fewer hours a day, that ain't going to happen. But what we would often do is schedule 4-day weekends 3 months in advance, fairly regularly. Say, no, you got to take 4 days off. You schedule it out so far that you can. And then what we did was track their billable hours, which is an indication of their productivity. And almost inevitably what happened was the more time they took off in vacation, the higher their billable hours became. They actually got more productive by backing off a bit. And so that was a good example of the proper binding of excess individual responsibility. Sometimes if you're better to yourself, like in a fundamental way, then you actually, it doesn't make that much, it's not that mysterious. You get more productive and things work out better for you. So